Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Giving USA 2026, What the Latest Data Means for Your Nonprofit. I'm Abby Shue, Executive Vice President and Partner at Benefactor Group, and I'm so glad that you could join us today. My colleague Kelly Quilter was unfortunately unable to join us due to illness, so I'm stepping in for her. She sends her regrets and hopes to connect with you another time. Now, let's dive in and get started. Each year, Giving USA gives our sector a snapshot of where philanthropy lands. And this year's data tells a more complicated story than the headline suggests. Over the next hour, we'll talk through what the numbers mean, what they signal for the sector, and what you can do with that information. Here's what we'll cover today: the state of philanthropy, Giving USA data and insights, sector-wide takeaways, action items for fundraisers, and then we'll leave time for Q&A. A few quick notes before we dive in. Please drop your questions in the Q&A box at any point. Our colleague Jesse Wright is here and monitoring the chat throughout and will bring questions to us as we go. We'll also have a dedicated time for discussion after the presentation. In a follow-up email, we will send a recording, the slide deck, and access to the full infographic. I'm joined today by two people who bring a real depth to this conversation from different vantage points. We'll go around and briefly introduce ourselves. I'm Abby Shue, Executive Vice President and Partner at Benefactor Group. I lead Benefactor Group's consulting team and oversee client service across fundraising, strategy, governance, talent, and technology. I partner with boards, executives, and staff to design practical, data-informed solutions that strengthen fundraising capacity, build organizational resilience, and position nonprofits for sustainable success. I have nearly 2 decades of leadership in philanthropy, strategy, and bring a blend of firsthand nonprofit leadership experience, board service, and consulting expertise to my work. I currently serve on the board of the Giving Institute.
Great. Thanks, Abby. I'll jump in. I'm Laura MacDonald. I think I probably know many of you in the audience and only wish that I could see you all. As you know, I'm the founder and a partner at Benefactor Group, which I founded in the year 2000, 26 years ago. And one of the great highlights of my career was the opportunity to serve as the board chair of the Giving USA Foundation in the early 2020s. And based on that, and having a front row seat to how the research is prepared and published every year, I think gives a particularly strong platform for us to bring to you what we're sharing with you today. Many of you also know that I'm the author of the Endowment Handbook. So later on in today's session, and perhaps in some future sessions, we'll be talking a bit about some of the learnings from Giving USA that can really be applied to endowment building. Rasheeda?
Yes, hi, my name is Rasheeda Childress. I'm the senior editor for fundraising at the Chronicle Philanthropy. And so there I guide our coverage of nonprofit fundraising, everything from everyday donors to donor advised funds, monthly giving, planned giving, and general strategies that help organizations raise money. And today I wrote the story for the Giving USA report, and I'm excited to talk to you guys about that.
Hot off the press.
Indeed. Thanks, Laura and Rasheeda. For more than 25 years, Benefactor Group has fueled nonprofits with powerful fundraising, people, and systems. And we work with clients across the country in education, healthcare, arts and culture, human services, and many other mission-driven organizations offering fundraising, talent, strategy, and technology support. Before we get into the data today, I want to point out a resource that you'll see us reference throughout the session. Benefactor Group's Giving USA infographic. You can scan the QR code now on screen to download the full PDF version. It will also be shared with you after our session today. I'll turn it over to Laura.
Great. Thanks, Abby. And I'll dive in and talk a little bit about what Giving USA and some other data sources tell us about the state of philanthropy today. And as I do, I'll just stop briefly and chat about our annual infographic. It's one of our favorite things that we do at Benefactor Group when we all sit together and brainstorm. And you'll see that this year's theme is hustle and bustle. And we thought that that was an appropriate theme because it was a year full of movement, economic ups and downs, policy shifts, big policy shifts, shifting donor behavior, everything happening all at once, kind of like a busy city. And as we go through the numbers, keep that framing in mind because you'll see that it's referenced in the graphics that we're sharing with you today. But also the top line story, and also what the numbers beneath it might tell. So top line, drum roll please. Giving USA estimates that total giving in 2025 was $617.2 billion. I had a little fun with that number earlier today. You know, it's larger than the total economy of major countries like Denmark or Sweden. It's about equal to the total global activity of Amazon or Walmart. And it's 3 times the total amount invested by venture capitalists in 2025, which I thought was particularly relevant given the different cachet that our 2 sectors sometimes have. But what we see is that it grew 5.7%, and the really good news is that that growth exceeded inflation, that giving grew faster than inflation. Let's break it down a little bit by source. Where did all of this generosity come from? And as you can see, as you all know, Giving USA breaks it down from 4 sources: individuals, foundations, corporations, and bequests. And the good news is that giving from all of those sectors, all of those sources increased and increased substantially. And you know, a 4.1% increase in giving from individuals, given that it's growing from a base of almost $400 billion, is a larger growth in dollar terms than something like corporate or foundation giving, even though it's smaller in percentages. So what we know is that while we see that individual donors account for 64% of all that giving, when you take into consideration that all bequests come from individual donors, and about half of the foundation giving comes from individuals directing what used to be their own money through a donor-advised fund or a closely held family foundation, then we can see that individual donors really account for something more like 83 to 85% of all of these dollars. And you can also see the significant growth in bequests. Now, that tends to be fairly volatile because there can be a ginormous bequest, a Paul Allen or a Paul Mellon, that suddenly dwarfs the prior year. And yet we'll talk a little bit about the trend line that we're beginning to see and whether or not it suggests that the much vaunted great intergenerational transfer of wealth is starting to occur. Let's talk about where all that money went. Among the recipient sectors, we see that 8 of the 9 recipient sectors experienced growth. Giving to religion didn't quite keep pace with inflation. Most of the other sectors did. Lest you be concerned about the decline in giving to foundations, and again, this is giving to foundations, and you see that's a decline, but if you take a look at a 5-year trend line, it still shows growth. That's really more reverting to the mean after a couple of extraordinary years in 23 and 24. As we see, we can still see that human services eclipsed giving to education a few years ago. And at that time, we began to wonder whether or not it had permanently earned that number 2 position. And I think I would say, based on certainly in the last 3, 4, 5 years, and we're even seeing a gap now between giving to human services and giving to education. But as I said, most of the sectors saw growth. And in fact, giving to education, public society benefit, and environment and animals grew more than 10%. And they all have the largest annualized rates of change over the last 5 years. You know, it's worth pausing for a moment on the economic landscape because, you know, most years we can talk about the economic factors that really drive charitable giving in America. We saw that the equity markets, the S&P specifically, was up by 16.4%. That can have a particular impact on giving from foundations. And frankly, it helps individuals, especially if they've got their retirement assets invested in the market. It helps them feel more prosperous. GDP increased by 5%, and we know that there's a very tight link between total giving and GDP. And personal disposable income grew, the kinds of income that everyday donors use. And yet, speaking of those everyday donors, we saw consumer sentiment drop to a 60-year low. And as I said a moment ago, many donors, individual donors, give out of a sense of personal security, personal prosperity, that I can make this gift and it won't affect my ability to provide food and shelter and education for my family. Well, when consumer sentiment dips to that extent, then we need to begin to wonder whether or not the everyday donor is going to feel that same sense of resilience. And then finally, before I pass it on to Rasheeda, I do want to go back to something that we mentioned earlier. Are we beginning to see evidence that the great wealth transfer is here? We've talked for quite a while about the fact that those who were born before 1965 have accumulated 124 trillion, with a T, trillion dollars in personal wealth. It's an extraordinary amount of money. It is not distributed equitably. It is concentrated in the hands of a relatively few high net worth and ultra high net worth households. And it is as those households age and begin to pass that wealth on, what happens? Well, first, it likely goes to a surviving spouse, which is almost certainly a woman. So we need to make sure that our fundraising models are designed to appeal to women. Secondly, some of it will go to heirs. Much of it will go to heirs. Some of it through a charitable vehicle like a trust or a donor advised fund. But about 18% of that is thought to be going to nonprofit organizations in the form of charitable bequests. And really, that's why many organizations are saying, like us, are saying to our clients, it's time to invest in planned giving. If you don't already have a strong planned giving strategy and infrastructure, there's no time to lose, because the baby boom generation will probably begin to pass on their wealth, with that passing of wealth accelerating until 2045. So it's time to really make sure that you're in a position to capture that. With that, Rasheeda, I want to pass it on to you. And I've talked about what the data says, but I think you've done a lot of work lately in some of your stories and reporting on what it means. So I'd like to pass it on to you to talk about some of the insights that you're taking away from all of this.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate that, Laura. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about we looked at what the data says, and I want to talk a little bit about what it means and sort of look at with a broad brush view of some of the trends and the issues that we've been seeing in the charitable giving as we talk to nonprofits and fundraisers. So first up, let's talk about donor advised funds. I believe this group knows about donor advised funds, but just to make sure we're all starting on the same page, they're simply just funds or accounts that donors put money into. They get the tax break immediately, and then they give that money out over, they give out in a week, or they can give it out over a month or years. And so with the tax changes of last year that have gone into effect this year, many donors decided that they wanted to front load their donor advised funds. Last tax year was just more advantageous for people who itemize, and those are often people who are starting donor advised funds. So earlier this year, I wanted to sort of see whether or not this front loading happened. And I had reached out to many of the big DAF sponsors like Fidelity, Vanguard, DAF Giving 360, which used to be Schwab. And they all experienced a big sort of boost in DAF giving towards the end of 2025. So DAF Giving 360 saw 50% year over year rising contributions. The National Philanthropic Trust saw like 140% increase in December account openings. Fidelity, they saw a 13.4% increase in the number of funds. And so there was this sort of boost. And I even, for the Giving USA story, I talked to John Bergdahl, who does all the data for Giving USA. And I asked him, I was like, what do you guys see in the data? And they thought there was about $2 billion worth of extra giving towards the end of 2025 going into these donor advised funds. And so that means there's money that's there. The only place that donors can give it or do anything with it is to give it to charity or to send it to a charity. And so a lot of organizations are really stepping up their game when it comes to donor advised funds, and they're making a lot of segmentation to be sure that if they know someone has a donor advised fund, to reach out to them to ask them if they can give from their donor advised fund. And that's been somewhat effective. And they've also been spending a lot of time when they do get gifts from donor advised funds, making sure that it's properly implemented in their system so that they can properly thank the donors and properly segment them into the right groups. So they're not sending them mailings that say, oh, have you heard of a donor advised fund, when they've been sending from a donor advised fund. So donor advised funds continue to be a big impact and are helping a lot of organizations. And I believe Susan G. Komen, who I talked to a few times, they had a big boost in giving from donor advised funds, like a doubling of it in the last year, just based on their outreach and efforts. Another big issue that is popping up this year is AI. And I like this cute slide with the rise of the robots. And the stat that's on here is quoted from some research from Cherry Koshi and Nathan Chappell about how donors are viewing the use of AI. And what donors want is transparency. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't want you to use AI, but what they want the transparency for the purposes of trust. They don't want to feel like they've been tricked or deceived. And I think that's sort of where it's important when we talk about saying we need to be transparent about donors. It's not an outright rejection of AI. And, you know, AI is in so many things. I'm doing another story on AI and how, you know, you can create sort of an environmentally friendly AI policy for your workplace. But when I was talking to some of the folks at the UN about AI's impacts, they were just saying, you know, AI isn't everything. AI is like, a lot of it is analytics. So AI is your spam filter. So your donors don't care if you're using a spam filter. They don't necessarily care if you're using it to segment and get a better sense of their giving patterns and who you want to reach out to. It's really in that sort of generative push where, you know, am I sending out an image that would trick a user into believing that this is a real person that you've helped, or this is a real student at your university, or this is a real thing? That's where you need to identify that you've used AI. And also possibly in some of the text creation, but it really depends on how much you have been making it in your own voice and making sure it's not just AI spit something out and you're sending it to your donors, because it's not very human, and fundraising is about that human connection. And organizations who, you know, write stuff just with AI and say that, the donors do not tend to respond well to that. Another issue that happened last year was just the depth of change for organizations. And I talked to an abortion organization at the beginning of the year before the administration took office. And they were like, you know, we were expecting this, and we were kind of coming up with some alternate fundraising. When the administrations change, we kind of do these things. And that was fine. But what happened last year was so unexpected, because, you know, no one expected USAID to be cut so severely. So there were so many things where people just kind of felt it was a nonpartisan thing. You had AmeriCorps, who helps a lot of nonprofits, and it just created a big, you know, change for them. And so the Urban Institute report noted that like a third of the nonprofits saw some kind of government-related funding disruption. 7% saw delays or freezes, 21% lost contracts or grants, and 6% received stop work orders. And that required just really a rethinking at organizations who did not necessarily have some backup for them to sort of figure out what was really critical to their mission. And on some level, that can be a good thing, to like really hone in on what your mission is and figure out which programs contribute to that or are central to that, and which things are a little bit more extraneous and allow cuts. Nonprofits that did a little bit better in this environment were ones that had more of a diversity of funding streams, who were able to talk to their donors, who maybe had some reserve funding. One organization I talked to last year was a pet shelter, Joybound in California, and they're really interesting because they had both partnerships and some earned revenue. And so one of the things that they were able to do to sort of help keep their funding going was because they partnered with an organization that did helped people who were formerly incarcerated find jobs. They had a school, a grooming school, where they taught these people how to groom animals, and they could groom the animals at the shelter, as well as they had a business model where they would take people from the community, and these formerly incarcerated people would groom them. And so it brought in revenue. It helped funders see that they had some additional revenue, and they were more willing to commit and go forward. So having sort of several income streams, it can help not just in helping you have that extra income, but it also helps your funders feel more secure as they try to support you through these difficult times. And then, yeah, next, this other thing that's popped up a lot is really just increased need. So independent sector found that like 68% of nonprofits expected to see an increased demand for their services in the coming year, and 28% anticipated a reduced staff capacity. And that is across the board. Just lots of organizations, all the organizations you would expect are having increased demand. Think like human services, social services organizations, doing things like homelessness, food pantries, animal shelters, those kind of organizations, as well as ones that you may not necessarily think of. I know a lot of the environmental organizations are having increased demands, in part because of some of the political things. They're doing more. They're bringing lawsuits. They're doing things that maybe in a previous administration, the Justice Department might have brought a lawsuit, and instead they're having to hire extra lawyers to say, we need this. So organizations across the board are experiencing this sort of increase in demand. So you're not alone if you're experiencing that. What a lot of the organizations are doing that I've talked to is they're leaning into their donors. They're talking to them about, hey, we have this increased demand. This is what we're seeing. They're asking for additional funding. They're often, we talked about donor advised funds. Those are the donors they're often hitting most because those donors have put that money aside and they may have something there. They're also partnering. I talked to a shelter in North Carolina that helps families who are unhoused, and they are partnering with other organizations so that they can sort of combine resources and provide services for the same population one place. So they partner with a healthcare group because people who are unhoused often can't get to the doctor, and so all these services are being able to be done together and fill the increased demand. And the other thing that was mentioned on this slide was the idea that staff are leaving. And I would say that's a big issue. People are worried about burnout. They're worried about their staff going to, just being tired of the mission not the mission, of the workload and going somewhere else because the workload is unsustainable. So I would say if you have, a couple of employees using AI and a lot of gumption and doing the work of 5 employees, that's not sustainable. You've got to sort of figure out what can reasonably done, and then give those employees support and focus on doing those things. And then another issue that has occurred, which is not as prevalent. No, but this is like something just to keep an eye on. M&R did a benchmark study, and they're a marketing and fundraising firm, and they do this study every year. But one of the things that they found, which was interesting, was that in 2025, there was an increased revenue by 17% for one-time gifts versus increased revenue of 12% for monthly giving. And that may be just relevant to the fact that 2025 felt like a crisis year, as 2026 may also feel like a crisis year, and that because of that, more people are in tune and they're just paying attention, and they're like, you know what, I need to give to this cause. I've heard about this thing. I know that the world seems to be changing and I should help. But it is something to watch, whether if people are sort of tiring of monthly giving. But again, monthly giving has done pretty well in general for a lot of the nonprofits. One of the nonprofits that I talked to this year was the Colorado Gives Foundation, and they mentioned they have a really interesting strategy to get monthly giving. And so Colorado Gives helps the about 4,500, 5,000 nonprofits in the state of Colorado with their giving day. And one of the things the foundation does is it offers to match the first monthly gift of people who give on the giving day. And with that, they found that they've gotten like a 30% increase in monthly gifts. And when they do this match, 70% of the people who take advantage of it, they are still there 12 months later. So only 30% drop off after getting a match. So that's an interesting strategy for monthly giving and something to definitely focus on. Okay. And then I guess the other thing that's a big issue for nonprofits this year is this idea of the K-shaped economy. And so you've got a big, and that's sort of like the new en vogue term for this idea that you have a group of people who are up here with their giving and the wealthier people, and then you have a group of people who are down below with their giving. And it's just a big gap, and it shows some of the wealth inequality that we have in our world, and it sort of helps perpetuate the lean into major gifts fundraising, because that tends to be where the money is, because those people in the top of the K-shaped economy, they still seem to be doing well. They're invested in the stock market. They're willing to give. They're able to give. The people on the lower part of that K-shaped economy, they are struggling. They may not be able to give, and they're trying. They may not have that purchasing power for donations. So I know, unfortunately, it's an economic issue, and you know, nonprofits are sort of dealing with something that's a greater issue. But I've talked to some colleges and universities about ways that they are trying to get more sort of everyday donors in, to bring them into the fold. And some of the things they're doing, particularly colleges and universities, is talking to students while they're still on campus and being like, hey, you should be generous. And when you leave, we want you to come back and give us either your time, your treasure, your talent, and giving them multiple ways to give. There is, they're also sort of rallying everyday donors to come in and volunteer, participate. One university I talked to, University of California, Berkeley, they're doing different volunteer activities and just try to make sure that they have multiple ones, because sometimes people feel like the only volunteer, or some of the big volunteer things like board service or things like that are just really big. They're big time commitments and people fear that. And so trying to do micro volunteer things so they can get people in. Yes. And then there we go. And so in addition to this part of the K-shaped economy is a heavy distribution of gifts at the top end. And I'm going to let Laura talk a little bit about this.
Thanks, Rasheeda. And I know you'll come back in as we do the Q&A towards the end. But I think in service to that K-shaped economy, and particularly the upper arm of the K, what we continue to see is that a handful of donors represent a significant proportion of all giving. And, in this particular slide, what we're seeing is that concentration increased from 24 to 25. The Chronicle does a wonderful annual issue on the biggest givers and found that in 2025, those 50 biggest givers represented $22.4 billion, up from $16.6 billion the prior year. And what we also know from the good work of organizations like Giving Tuesday and the Fundraising Effectiveness Project and even the Blackbaud Index, what we see is that that top of the pyramid, or the upper arm of the K, is quite different than the experience that's being felt by smaller organizations and by everyday donors, where the giving is challenged, and in fact the smaller the gift size, seemingly the less wealth of the donor, the greater the challenge is that people are experiencing. This has been an ongoing trend in the sector. We've been aware of it, I think, ever since The missing middle came out several years ago, and certainly it's been tracked by FEP and others. And I think it's something that collectively we're all working on to address through things like the good work of the Generosity Project and some other insights that can help us continue to engage everyday donors in ways that have them feeling good about supporting the organizations that we serve. And I think that feeds directly into our next topic, which Abby talking about some of the ways our colleagues can put this data to good use in their own daily practice.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rasheeda and Laura. And yes, let's dive into how to make this data useful on a day-to-day basis. First, amid a changing landscape, it's important to remember what consistently encourages donors to give. First, donors and especially high net worth individuals resonate with messages that make them the agent of change rather than the nonprofit. So, for example, with your gift, you can change the world rather than when you support us, we can change the world. Second, tell stories, which should be more than just examples. Strong stories feature a hero, a conflict, a choice, and ultimately a resolution. And they're meant to resonate and bring your impact to life. And whenever possible, the research actually shows that our compassion and charity is highest when focused on one individual. So focus your story on having one individual hero. Studies also show that social norms and giving are strongly linked. So when people have information about how others give, and especially those that they consider to be their peers, they are more likely to give themselves. So you want to convey people like you make gifts to this to causes like ours. So really helping them to be part of that community of donors and part of a collective effort. And lastly, confer insider status. We know that top donors and key volunteers expect to be included in your plans early. And you want to emphasize to these individuals that they are among a small circle of trusted partners helping to shape the future of your vision and your work. Second, we know that charitable giving is becoming more complex, and you heard about some of these changes, right? There are new tax laws, different giving platforms, rise in donor advised funds. And for fundraiser, this means that the old playbook focused on asking for money is no longer enough. The future belongs to professionals who can really serve as advisors to our donors, helping as thought partners, helping donors to navigate this new complexity, pinpoint their passions, and find ways to maximize the impact that they are seeking. Some strategies for really serving as that advisor are here on the screen, developing an understanding of the different vehicles, knowing when to bring in other partners and advisors, connecting donors to the right opportunities for their greatest passions. And
Abby,
third,
before we go on, we did have a question in chat for, I think, Laura.
okay.
Um, Vera Levitt asked, do we know how much of this individual giving increase was the specific to Mackenzie Scott and her large unrestricted donation to organizations in the last couple of years?
I'll field that, and Rasheeda or Abby might want to weigh in as well. Yes, we do. I can't recall it off the top of my head. But if you take a look at Giving USA, it's an econometric model. There aren't gerbils at the IRS running on wheels counting every gift in every tax return. It's an econometric model that's reviewed by scholars that has a real academic review body. But what they find is that the econometric model cannot itself account for outliers, gifts that are larger than 0.1% of the total. And so they factor those in separately. All of the gifts that are factored in as outliers are listed in the actual book. Sadly, the book won't be available until July 8th. The data is available now. The full book comes out on July 8th. And there you will see a list of gifts from Mackenzie Scott, from Bloomberg, from Gates, and others that were added in after the econometric modeling in order to adjust the total amount. And so, yes, it was enough that it was considered to be an outlier and factored in. I think the other thing I wanted to say as I hand it back to Abby to deal with this notion of transitioning from fundraiser as asker to fundraising as advisor is that Rasheeda's colleague, Drew Lindsay, did a nice story in the Chronicle of Philanthropy that you can probably find in their archives. It's less than 2 months old, I think, and really expanded on this notion that we're called on to be much more than simply social connections and askers, that there's a lot more to our work today, which I think, frankly, for me, makes it more gratifying. And I hope you find it that way too, Abby.
Oh, and I will just really quickly add, I actually asked John Burko about this, and so McKinsey Scott gave 6.65 billion, which was a third of the 19.2 billion in mega gifts that they found out last year.
Great. Thank you,
There you have
Rasheeda.
it. There's the data.
Yeah, that's excellent. Great. We'll dive back into sort of how we can bring this data to life in our regular work. So lastly, as we heard today, it's an essential time to invest in your planned giving programs as the great wealth transfer continues to accelerate. So what does that look like? Get educated on endowment, equip your board and your leadership and your gift officers to talk about giving in perpetuity. Laura has written the Endowment Handbook, which is an excellent resource for this. Set policies that will advance where bequest proceeds go and adopt sound guidelines for acceptance, investment, and spending. And endow things that your donors love, right? Donors give more to specific purposes than to general funds. And so find those opportunities that you will continue to do long into the future and have something concrete for donors to invest in.
And Abby, I'll just say
Yeah.
there that I'm sure that amongst those who are watching today, their CFOs love unrestricted gifts to the endowment. But we know that that's contrary to how donors typically behave. A few might behave that way. But that doesn't mean that it needs to add to your budget. You can find ways to build endowments that apply to the work that you do on a day-to-day basis. So if you're an art museum, such as the one where you used to work, Abby, you can have an endowment for the care of the collection or the interpretation of the collection that can be budget relieving, if you will, and helps sustainability while aligning with the interests of that donor.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great point, Laura. And in every organization, there are things that they will absolutely need to do indefinitely. And so finding opportunities to create endowments for those things makes a lot of sense. Also, identifying existing intentions, right? So review donor files and likely expectancies. If you don't already have one, establish a legacy society. And if you do, make sure that you're engaging them actively and having your gift officers equipped to have conversations about legacy plans. And then tell stories of donors who have left the organization, part or all of their estate. Again, social norming is an important piece of how this works. So elevating the stories of those who have done it can help to inspire others and fuel your mission. And then one more number that I'll share before we close out the data portion, and this came from a study that was done by Russell James, but increasing investment in fundraising by $1 yields about $6 in contributions in the next year. And the research actually found that investing the same $1 in a consulting partner yields $27 the next year. And so we share this, of course, not to be self-serving, but it's genuinely one of the clearest findings in the data that investing in capacity pays for itself many times over. And it's a really useful number to have in your back pocket as you talk to your organizations about investments in your own staff or partners to help advance philanthropy.
Hey, Jesse, we have a question in chat. Peg is asking us to go back to slide 24. I think because I interjected that question, we maybe sped past a couple of the other competencies that we were going to talk about. And I would say for learning more about storytelling that's grounded in shared values, you could do nothing better than to follow the work of the good Dr. Russell James, either his LinkedIn posts or his website, encouragegenerosity.com. All of his stuff is freely available. He's on the faculty at Texas Tech and really talks about how to tell stories that are grounded in engagement, not persuasion, how to tell stories that position everybody as a hero. We would not want a world in which the people we serve are victims and the donors are heroes because they come in with money. That's imbalanced. But nor do we want a world in which the resilient people who receive our services are heroes and nobody else in the story matters. And so how can we tell stories that respect all of the players in this philanthropic equation and elevate them all to heroes? And then the final one might be the toughest of all, but really one of the key indicators that you have a true culture of philanthropy is that you understand when a donor's uh, vision is not really aligned with your mission. When the gift that they want to give to you is a difficult fit within your organization, but a perfect fit with your peers down the road. We can do a lot to build trust, and trust is really the foundation of the work that we do. By understanding that generosity needs to be aligned with the mission, and when it's not, the best thing we can do is advise a donor to for a place where their gift might be uh, put to better use, more closely aligned with their values. So I think, Peg, that was the question that you had, and I wanted to make sure that we went back to it.
Great. Thank you, Laura. As a reminder, as we move into Q&A, I just want to let you know that everything that we've covered today and quite a bit more is available in Benefactor Group's Giving USA infographic. Again, you can scan the QR code on the screen, or you can visit benefactorgroup.com/givingusa2026 to download the PDF, share it with your team, share it with your board. And as a reminder, we will be providing a recording of today's session as well. So with that, I want to turn it over to Jesse to bring us some of the questions that you all have been submitting throughout our session. We'll go ahead and get started and encourage you to continue to add questions.
Great, thank you, Abby. First, I'm going to start with one of our questions we had prepared beforehand. Economic conditions were strong on paper, but maybe a little bumpy underneath. How should we read the combination of a strong S&P 500 and GDP against a 60-year low in consumer sentiment? Which one mattered more for giving?
Rasheeda, I'd love to hear your opinion on that.
I think you have to, unfortunately, it's tough. I think, there's that old, saying, Willie Sutton, the bank robber, they asked him, why do you rob banks? And he said, that's because where the money's at. Well, I think there's a lot of money in this sort of wealth class, and people are going there because it's easier to get a big chunk of money there than it is to cobble together a bunch of little chunks of money into an equal amount. And so I think you do still have to reach out to those donors as best that you can, and try to keep a strong focus on those everyday donors who are supporting your mission and bringing them in for volunteer work, and just sort of keeping them close, because there is this great wealth transfer. Some of them will get some money from this. Now, there's a question how many will have it eaten up in medical debt, but they're also a question, but they will feel more comfortable. And that's really what the economy is about. It's like, what do we feel? And so if you have that consumer confidence where people feel down, even if they are economically okay, that doesn't help your organization. So really keeping close to them, so that when they see that you are in need, or that there are people who need more, that they will still, even if they don't feel great, still be willing to offer some sort of help to your organization, whether that's through volunteerism, through money, whatever.
I think it's interesting because that also points to an answer to Simon's question in the chat about the overall decline in the percentage of households that participate in charitable giving. The answer is yes, we continue to see that. I think the best sources to look for that include the panel study on income dynamics that is part of the University of Michigan. The Lilly Family School cites that a lot, Giving Tuesday and the FEP project. And I think some of that is for the very reason Rasheeda just cited, is that as fundraisers, we want to be efficient. We're measured sometimes on our efficiency, and the most efficient thing we can do is to go to those high net worth households and secure gifts there, rather than the lower ROI we get from going to everyday donors. And yet, I think that we're seeing more and more that there are other compelling reasons, including the future of our own pipelines, to engage those everyday donors.
So Dylan has a great question in chat. Have you seen anything in your research that says that corporate giving has narrowed over the past decade? I'm curious if you think that companies are choosing one or two causes to support, as opposed to the old United Way model that spread giving across a wide breadth of organizations.
I can jump in, Rasheeda, but tell me what you have seen at the Chronicle in the work you've done.
We've asked this question sort of a lot with the Giving USA report this year, and just also the tax law changes, where corporations now have to sort of get above that threshold in order to get a tax break. And it seems like what we're hearing, and actually, Laura may be more familiar with the historical data because I feel like corporations are trending a little bit higher than they have maybe 10 years ago. But just in the last couple of years, people have seen a softening, and it really sort of depends. It's twofold. Even when I talked to John Bergdahl at Giving USA about the data, the corporate giving data it's not as rich. They don't have enough data about small corporations versus big corporations. So it can just sort of depend on sort of where you're going. So I talked to a couple organizations, and last year they saw some softening in corporate gifts with corporations whose businesses, were having economic trouble. So if the economy is not doing well for your corporations, you're just not going to give. Where people are seeing strength is local. Corporations seem to want to give locally. They want to give in the place where their employees live. And if you can sort of connect with those employees and show that you are going to have an impact locally and impact along their sort of CSR, the corporate social responsibility initiatives, that seems to be what people are saying is working for them.
Yeah, I see that a couple of things. In the past, like in 1986, corporate giving was as high as 2% of corporate pre-tax profits. And of course, the late great Ken Dayton used to advocate for corporations to give 5% of their corporate pre-tax profits, which never happened. But we saw a decline. It got below 1% of corporate pre-tax profits. It seems to have settled back up at 1% of corporate pre-tax profits. And in fact, in 25, corporate pre-tax profits did not grow faster than inflation. So it was a little bit of a challenged year for corporations in that regard. And we also see that the new tax law, which we might want to talk about, I think is going to create even more of a hurdle for them. I think a couple of trends we see. One is that, especially for local giving, corporations are more and more relying on matching gifts with their employees. And so we're seeing some richer matching gift programs on giving where their employee affinity groups participate. And so in some ways it democratizes the corporation's giving because they're following the lead of their employees. I have seen, and it's anecdotal, Dylan, I don't have data to back this up, but in some cases, yes, corporations, especially now that they're sort of stateless, I will say, they may have moved their corporate headquarters 2 or 3 times. Their CEO might jet in on a Tuesday morning and jet back home halfway across the country on Friday afternoon. They're not as embedded in place as they once were, the larger corporations. And so we are seeing anecdotally that some of them are strategically choosing a few causes that align with their workforce or their product and really leaning into those, and then allowing their local giving to be driven by the employee choices. But we're also seeing, and this touches a little bit on that great big interesting question that Claudio asked that I don't think we have time to go to give it its proper due, but we are seeing that corporations are using some more of the tools at their disposal to support organizations, whether it's in-kind giving. And frankly, a lot of that corporate giving number is in-kind gifts from pharmaceutical companies giving their pharmaceutical goods directly to the patients in need. So that's a big chunk of that. But they're also using other ways through their SDG or ESG programs, through their corporate marketing, doing sponsorships, through their workforce development, providing either funding and or people to do some of the work of the nonprofit organizations, which is an imperfect model in some cases. But we see that corporations are expressing their generosity, if you can call it that, in editorial, if in ways other than simply their direct corporate giving or giving through their foundation.
We've gotten a couple of questions about mergers in the Q&A, and I do want to return to tax changes after that, but let's talk about this. Chris asks, are there any thoughts on mergers within the sector and impact on donations? How have you seen nonprofit mergers impact donor retention and fundraising success? And Maria adds on to this, asking about, are there any larger organizations or foundations that are encouraging or fostering this collaboration? Many organizations do similar work, and I wonder if we might see some merging of those in the future as well.
My suspicion is that any insights about charitable giving post-merger is going to be very anecdotal. I just don't think anybody's collected a large enough data set to see trend lines about what happens when there is a merger. I just frankly got off a Zoom call with a client, two large healthcare organizations that are merging. I think, we go back to basics there, and what's most important is to sustain the trust that donors had with either of the two entities that has now become the new entity. I see a lot of talk, but less actual reward or action when it comes to encouraging nonprofit mergers and collaboration. It's hard. It's hard. It increases the degree of difficulty of our work. I think there are some good examples. Rasheeda, I think you cited one or two earlier where people are looking at expressing their missions in interesting ways in collaboration with other organizations. But just know that it's hard work. Strategic partnerships are probably less risky than a outright merger. And I love to go back to an old article from Stanford Social Innovation Review called Merge Wisely that came out at the beginning of the Great Recession. So it's over a decade old, and yet I think it explores the different kinds of collaborations that nonprofits might consider, and frankly comes to the conclusions that mergers are the highest degree of difficulty, the highest risk, and perhaps the lowest ROI. Abby, what have you seen?
I was thinking about a conversation you and I recently had with a foundation leader who was talking about collaboration, if not to the extent of merger, but just recognition of the investment of time that takes to think about strategy implications and governance implications. And certainly if you look to things like shared services, staffing implications. And so I think, anecdotal, but some interest from foundation leaders in creating space and opportunity for organizations to even explore that, because there's so much that has to be considered in order to get that right at any level of real collaboration, but certainly at the level of deciding that you're going to merge.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add. I think mergers are hard. It's just a lot because you have to get two organizations down to one. You lose staff, you lose sometimes some of the momentum. So I think I've seen a lot more just sort of people partnering. Is what we've talked to people who I've talked to. They've been doing more partnering and figuring out like where their interests align and where they can use shared resources. So, particularly if they're serving the same populations, so that they can lower their expenses each.
Going back to those tax changes that we were talking about before, you mentioned that they affected 2025 giving. How do you anticipate they will affect 2026?
From a data perspective, what I can say is that in the previous two times that there were major changes to the tax code, 1987, 2017, the year in which the change was adopted, but before it took effect, there was a rush to give. There was an increase in giving in the fourth quarter of that year because people wanted to give under the old rules. They were more generous. And I'll just speak anecdotally. My husband and I rushed to give at the end of last year because we knew that it would be better for us. And frankly, we used a donor advised fund to hold some of that giving so we can now be distributing it over the coming years without taking the cut that the new tax law will provide. In 2018 and 1987, giving dipped. It did recover within a year or two and continue its growth trajectory. But I think some of what I've read about the impact of this tax law, some of the estimates done by Urban Institute or Giving Tuesday or Indiana University aren't great.
Yeah, some of the estimates are not. Yeah, they're not great in terms of because we have this wealth inequality and so much of the wealth giving is coming from these people in the top of the K. Those were the people impacted by the tax cuts, and those are the people who rushed to give last year and may not give this year, or may give differently. Now it's interesting. I've been talking to a couple of people. Someone at the Houston Humane Society were saying that they actually have been talking to a few people have said, we've been talking to our donors, and we know donors who said, we're bunching and we're not going to give you anything this year. And they have decided we're going to put them in a separate segmentation so that we're just sort of stewarding them this year. They were like, thank you for your gift last year. And donors who gave more, but they haven't really been able to get that clear picture, they're going to continue to solicit and see if they will continue to give this year. But it's a little bit uncharted because you're not necessarily going to be able to talk to all of your donors. You don't know if a big gift last year meant they were trying to bunch or if they just had bonus, and we're like, let me give you more. So I think it's going to be a lot of sort of trial and error and learning this year as people figure out, though, for the people who told you, and I would treat them accordingly and just be really kind and acknowledge that you know what they're doing.
And for some people, this isn't going to become apparent to them until they do their taxes in March and April of 27. So, it could draw it out. I guess the silver lining is that everyday donors, and we can't just divide this by high net worth versus everyday households. You know, business owners almost always itemize, regardless of what their income at the end of the year is, because of the nature of their work. So small business owners are itemizers, whether they make a lot or a little. And there might be some very high net worth households with they're high salaried people, and so they have very simple taxes. The good news is that for everyday donors, we do have a universal tax deduction that has been restored. I think that sends a good message to those folks. Oh, I guess giving is a good thing after all. And so fiddling around with $1,000 per individual, $2,000 per household may be an opportunity to help us restore giving amongst some of those everyday households that haven't been as active since the last tax change was adopted.
We have another question about this inequality piece. Do you feel that the costs of inflation and rising prices will be felt more deeply this year by households, leading to a decrease in giving?
I mean, I
Who's
think
got a crystal ball?
yeah, it's hard to say, but I think it depends on the household. I mean, I think certainly if the K-shaped economy continues, those households that are struggling are going to feel that and may choose to pull back. Some people have already told me that their donors on the lower end are saying, I like your cause, I want to keep giving, but it's, the economy is very bad for me right now. And so I think we'll just have to see.
Take a look at the functionality on our website that we will update with this new data called Giving is Resilient. And what you will find is that, giving is resilient. Some of that may be because of the higher end of the income spectrum. And the other thing I would say is don't make decisions for your donors. The conversation in your office should not be, oh, it's tough out there, we shouldn't ask our donors to give. Don't make that decision for them, but tone matters, and acknowledging that, while they're making a lot of tough decisions, they hope that they'll keep your cause amongst those things that they continue to support.
Last question. Where do you see the biggest opportunity for nonprofits to use this year's Giving USA data and other sector-wide data?
I would jump in and say, the evidence is here around bequests. And so the opportunity and, in fact, I would say responsibility to invest in your legacy programs, I think is one of the biggest. But I'll also mention board education, right? One of the responsibilities of every nonprofit board is to ensure sufficient financial resources. And so making sure that your board members understand what is happening in the philanthropic sector as they think about your organization's strategy and how they contribute to that work is a real opportunity to take this from being an interesting annual report to something that is really operationalized, not only by your staff, but also by your volunteers.
Yeah, I would just say planned giving as well. I think that's a crucial thing, particularly with the great wealth transfer coming. And also, don't be intimidated by planned giving. You don't have to get your people to go do a new will. It's just as simple as a beneficiary designation on a 401k, like give us 5%, or just something they can do in 5 minutes at home from their computer.
I agree with both of you. It's still astounding how often we'll meet with a board that doesn't understand that individual donors drive 83% of all charitable giving, that really want their team to be focusing on corporate giving or foundation grants. And so using this data to demonstrate where your resources ought to be deployed, I think is one of the best things that you can do.
With that, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for the webinar and extend a big thank you to Laura and Rasheeda for sharing their expertise and perspective. We hope today's conversation gave you a clearer picture of where philanthropy stands today and a few concrete things that you can put into practice. A quick reminder before we wrap that you'll receive a follow-up email with a recording of today's session, the slide deck, and our full Giving USA infographic. And if your question wasn't answered live, please don't hesitate to reach out to us directly. We're always glad to continue the conversation. This is one of our favorite days of the year, getting to talk about this. And on behalf of all of us at Benefactor Group, thank you for the important work that you do every day to strengthen organizations who serve the common good. Have a great rest of your day.